Hello, and I'm so excited to be here at the When Women Speak event. And my name's Emily Ridout, and before I get started with the talk I'll be discussing today with you, I'd like to take a moment just to introduce myself. So my name's Emily, and I am an AstroYoga specialist. What that means is I specialize in the combination of astrology and yoga, which I did not make up. It's existed for thousands of years, and there are just very few AstroYoga specialists out there. But I do have 2 degrees in folklore in which I studied the esoteric wisdom traditions of both the East and the West. And today what I would like to share with you is some of the secret truths that are hidden in disciplines like astrology and yoga that you can start to use whether you know astrology or yoga or not. And so if you've ever had a friend who started a yoga practice, or maybe you yourself at one point started yoga, or maybe you're practicing yoga now, a very common response to it is that people who start practicing yoga are like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. I suddenly feel lighter. I suddenly feel more able to speak my truth. I suddenly feel like things that I thought were impossible are possible for me. Because these disciplines do offer us a taste of freedom, and not freedom in the sense of like, oh, do whatever you want. Freedom in the sense that each individual person is a sovereign being. Like you, no matter what society tells you, culture tells you, your family, your friends, well-meaning bystanders tell you, you are completely free to make any choice at any time. It's very unlikely that certain choices will be made for a number of reasons, because we're enculturated, we have certain worldviews, and so sometimes people become really predictable. But what astrology and yoga help you do is to step out of that predictability and to step into your wholeness. So I'd like to talk a little bit about a main concept that actually most yoga students and yoga teacher training students don't actually know much about, especially in their initial stages, and that is the difference between the specificity of being you in your particular circumstances, with your particular challenges and your particular dreams, with the sort of wholeness of being that exists within you and beyond you. And so you hear this term a lot, spiritual bypassing. That's not what we're talking about here, not being like, okay, well now I've transcended all my issues, everything's great. I haven't had to actually face my challenges, but now I'm fine. This is actually the way to actually get to that point where you can take a more meta view in order to move through your challenges, in order to make choices that are authentic to the specificity of your being. So bear with me for the next few minutes and I'll tell you a little bit about it. And truly for me, when I first learned this knowledge, the knowledge itself allowed me to move into the experiential awareness and practice of it. And so sometimes just by taking a larger viewpoint and knowing that this is sort of a model for considering your reality, sometimes that alone allows you to move into it without practice. And then of course some people might want to have more practice, and of course practice yields results. So here it is. So you yourself, and you see this in the zodiac wheel, I read charts and all the time people come in, they want to know, about their love lives and their Venus signs. They want to know about their sun signs and where they're going in life. They want to know about career and family and relationships and money, and all of that is so wonderful, right? And it's what makes life really potent and exciting and specific for who you are. But on a larger, more esoteric level, if you consider an astrology chart, it's a circle. Usually, sometimes it's a square if you're doing Vedic astrology, but it's generally a circle. And the circle is the esoteric symbol. It's the symbol we've chosen for the sun in astrology. It's the symbol we've chosen for the number 0, which has a lot of secrets hidden in it from numerology. And so this is the combination of what yoga and numerology, astrology all say, is that this circle is actually the key. So inside the circle, you exist. Your specificities, your choices, your challenges, your heartbreaks, those things that really seem like stumbling blocks to you, they all exist inside the circle. And the circle itself, though, holds everything. It allows for everything. It holds it in its conscious awareness. And the circle itself is the true nature. Sometimes people look at their charts and they say, oh, well, I don't have any planets in this house or that house. And I'm like, yeah, but there's still an energetic continuum there. So it doesn't mean that that house of your life is empty. And if you think about your life existing in its specificity within an aura of wholeness, and this is a wholeness beyond what the human brain likes to comprehend. You know, like we can see around us, we can see our neighborhood, our climates, our friends and family members. We can even look at the news or a documentary and see sort of what we think is going on somewhere else in the world. But in our limited perspective, out of our own two eyes, we're not actually experiencing the fullness of every other human being's experience. You could never totally understand my distinct experience, and I could never totally understand yours, although we have this beautiful thing of empathy and compassion where we can reach deeper understandings. But on another level, we are all connected to the potency of an absolute consciousness. And yoga and meditation and astrology and tarot, they all teach that this absolute consciousness, even though it sometimes contains the pain of the world and it sometimes contains the pain and the suffering of a specific experience, the true nature of the absolute consciousness is that it is joyful, it is blissful, it has peace, but not just the peace that's kind of boring, the peace that's like the shimmering perfection of loving bliss in a peaceful moment. And it's alive and permeating everything that exists. This sounds great, right? Like everything is love, everything is bliss. It sounds great. But as you know, it's different when you're living it, right? Because people are facing real challenges. You know, there's all sorts of crises happening on Earth. People suffer for all sorts of reasons. Violence on the personal and the large scale happens. And so you wonder, you know, how could this be? You know, how could this act of violence be connected to this larger perspective of consciousness and bliss? And yet you hear people, I heard a story recently of a reporter who was in a catastrophic event where people, like bombs were going off, there was like carnage and devastation. And she said she experienced this experience of like, I might die. She didn't happen to die. She lived to tell this story, but she said, you know, I realized I could die in that moment. And for some reason, instead of feeling this sense of fear and gripping and terror, I felt a strange sensation of peace and love. And I could see, she said she could see the energies of love moving even as this devastation happens, which doesn't mean that when you act in a way that harms someone else, that you're acting from a place of love. Of course not, right? That's on the relative scale. But on this other, she entered into this other sort of meta consciousness, perhaps as a way to get her through that. And she said she tapped into that. And so I couldn't imagine being in that circumstance myself, but I do take that as one of a more extreme example of how this sort of layering of reality works, because our subjective suffering, our subjective challenges, our subjective joys even, they exist sort of on this relative level. And when you're living on the relative plane, which we all do, all the time, you know, someone gives you something delicious to eat, it makes you happy. Someone, spits on your shoes, it makes you sad. Like we have these sort of fluctuating experiences. But always, no matter what the fluctuating experience is, whether someone's given you ice cream or someone spit on your shoes, there's a way to tap into this larger view of wholeness. And in yoga, there's something called the malas, which are the sheaths that conceal our true nature from us. And it's sort of esoteric, but in the malas, you see a point. They've mapped it out. I love yoga for this reason. The yoga philosophers map out what they think the construction of the universe is, and it's a really helpful model. So they map out what it is from this sort of absolute consciousness that's represented by the zero or the circle or the fullness of the astrology chart, down all the way into the lowest of the elements, which they view as earth and the things that happen. It's called the tattvas, if you ever want to look it up. And there's a place in it called the malas. And that's the place where the true nature of ourselves as divine beings gets erased from our consciousness. And so it's really hard, when you're going through something's challenging you, to say, oh, it's actually fine because I know I'm a divine being. Like, I'm not saying to do that, and, it would be difficult too. But to remember in those moments of challenge that even when we're faced with something and it's gripping us and it's challenging us, and like, how do you move through this moment of grief, this moment of pain? Of course, on the relative scale, you need to protect yourself, make choices that will offer you the most beneficial outcomes, of that experience, whatever it may be. But on another level, it's important to remember that these things are temporary, and our truest nature is that of in some ways divinity or wholeness, whatever you'd like to call it. And there's a wonderful example of how this works. We are actually very gifted to live in the relative scale. And you wonder, like, oh, well, wouldn't it be better to just live in this divine consciousness? Well, the answer is no. And I always love the example that the divine consciousness, if it's permeating everything, that's so great, right? But in a sense, it is then everything in a way. And if you think about clay, clay that you would use to make a pot or a coffee mug or whatever, you have it in its raw form, and it's so wonderful because it's full of potentialities and everything could happen with it, right? But if you think about it moving down into more specificity to the point where it's formed and fired and ready to go, it's actually of much more use to you if it becomes a coffee mug or a teapot, right? Because when you want coffee, you don't want raw clay, you want a teapot. And so there's a gift of being in our relative state, in our human bodies, in whatever experience you're having at that moment. And you have an opportunity to be a gift and a presence and the coffee mug, the proverbial coffee mug, to yourself, to those around you, right? And to live in your own experience. And so, when you're in your own experience, you can go into your yoga practice, you can go into your astrology chart, you can say, oh, I noticed that my moon sign is here in this space, And because it's in that space on the relative level, what I need to do to balance emotionally, what I need to do to feel nurtured, is to do these sorts of activities, is to allow nurture in my life in these sorts of ways, is to put boundaries around these sorts of things. And it's all written there in your astrology chart. And if you guys have questions who are watching this about your moon sign and how to best balance it or how to deal with it on a relative level, I'd be happy to answer those. Just send me a DM and I do free 15-minute consultations. I'll send you a link to that and we can chat about it. But, whatever you do on the relative scale, keeping it tied to the true reality of, hey, I'm specific, but I'm also ethereal. I'm specific, but I'm also always whole. And there's nothing that anybody else could add to me to make that truth more true. There's nothing that someone could take away from you also that could make that truth more true. And the true nature of the human being, and this is like the crux of what yoga and astrology and numerology and the tarot and all the mystery traditions that I've studied have gotten to, is the truth that there is an aspect of us that is divine, that is sovereign, that is able to transcend time and space and circumstance. And that if we hold on to that while holding on and moving through and integrating and alchemizing our personal experience, then our experience of this life, of these experiences, will get so much better, so much richer, so much more aligned with what you deeply and truly desire. And that's amazing. And there's all these other, like, we could get into every planet. We could get into every tarot card. We could get into like the secrets of alchemy, which people always thought was a metallic tradition, but was actually also a tradition of meditation and mysticism from the Middle East and Europe. And so you could get into it, but the truth is everybody who studied these things throughout history seemed to align at a couple really similar truths. And the more we can work with and grapple with those truths in our lives, the easier and the more fluid facing challenges becomes. And so whether you're working on how to use your voice, how to move through a difficult personal situation, how to find more money in your life, how to move your career forward, all of those things can happen on the relative scale. Your astrology chart can help with that. Your yoga practice can help with that. Your energy work can help with that. Your actions on the earth plane can help with that. But just never forget that no matter what you want or where you want to go, where you are now is also a beautiful place. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. I think I'm running out of time, but I do want to say thank you to Sarah for having me on this Change Happens When Women Speak event. And I really do believe that change does happen when women speak and when people, all of us, when we return to our own divine nature. So keep using your voices and thank you so much for listening.